And this opening picture is a picture of the university where I work. And if we have any snow, we've really got problems at this time of year or any time of year. You mentioned Mullaloo Beach, and this is a photo of my local beach, which is just a little bit further north. And as is usual in Australia, I want to acknowledge the Noongar people as the traditional custodians of the country on which I'm speaking. That's the Wujak Noongar Budja, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. This land was never ceded and there's been no treaty. This is an ongoing issue. As Tila's mentioned, if you were expecting Tim, you've got me, and Tim has COVID. He's just become a professor, so congratulations to Tim. These are some of his many achievements, and I'm sorry to disappoint anyone, but actually I didn't work on the Code of Ethics for the Commonwealth or for Victoria, but I did work on the West Australian one. And Tim and I are actually located about 3,000 kilometres apart. So although we talk quite frequently, we don't actually meet face to face very often because it's quite expensive. My background is that I've been involved in youth work and youth work education for, I hate to say this, about 45 years. So you can imagine I was ever so young when I started. And I've been involved in youth work education, both in the formal and the informal sectors. My main research has been in the scholarship of teaching and learning as it affects youth work and higher education systems, as well as curriculum for youth work and some youth issues, particularly around youth homelessness. What I'm going to be talking about today is a paper on adultism that Tim and I wrote with Howard Williamson, who I'm sure many of you will know, and Harry Shear. And we wrote this because some of the ideas of human rights has been very central to Australian youth work and was formally written into the definition of youth work in 2013, and both Tim and I were on the steering group for that. But what we wanted to explore with this is exactly what is meant and what the pitfalls can be when applying a human rights perspective to youth work. We're fully supportive of it. We think that this is the way to go, but there have been a few quite worrying misinterpretations, if you like, and I'll pick up on some of the ideas that have been mentioned by some of the other speakers. So adultism is a belief system based on the idea that adults are in some sense superior to children or young people, and that young people by default are inferior or of lesser worth, or you don't need to really take very seriously what they say. But the term also describes the social structures, practices and behaviours based on those beliefs. And many of those social structures, as I think some of our earlier speakers have alluded to, have embedded adultism within the social institutions and norms that we take for granted. So a first step in realising human rights as a basis for youth work is finding a basis from which to challenge some of the things that some people think of as common sense ideas about how to interact with young people. And this starts with that young people are subject to all sorts of legal restrictions that are not applicable to adults. So status offences, things that would be legal for adults that are not legal for young people. One of those is that the voting age, and I'm very pleased to hear that at least at some levels of government, this has been lowered to 16 in Scotland. This is a debate that is still to be had in Australia. And in many ways, what has occurred over the last 10 years has seen the Convention on the Rights of the Child being used to obliterate the concept of youth. And I'll talk some more about that in a moment. And that's not certainly not what, as youth workers, we would want to support. So there are quite a lot of government structures that sanction unequal treatment on the basis of age for young people. I'm a family historian, and a very interesting thing that I noticed in some of the documents was if you look at the old migration records, shipping records, it has a category for children and a category for adults. And children are under 12 and adults are 12 and over, which seems odd to modern sensibilities, but didn't seem odd at that time. Now, I know there's a lot of debates about that, and it's a complicated idea. But often the idea that young people are not adults has not been used to the advantage of young people, especially when you look at things like youth wages, where young people are doing adult jobs, but are not being paid the same as the adults that they work alongside. So, Article 1, the right of young people to participate in decisions made about them, is enshrined in the United Nations Convention on Human Rights. But this raises the question of what exactly do we mean by participate? Because that can mean a lot of different things. And that same clause doesn't actually protect young people against adultism and being discriminated against on the grounds of age. And the answer to that is it depends. I'm not going to go through the many, many different models there are on participation, all of which have some strengths and some limitations. But I have included them in the end references at the end of this presentation. What they have in common is the idea that participation can take place either minimally or much more extensively. And as youth workers, the sort of participation that we're talking about when we discuss rights is not at the minimal end of participation. It's near the maximal end. So the minimal end is being present, taking part, and the sort of consultation that occurs, but where the consultation doesn't affect the decision that's being made. So the consultation is either tokenistic, or it's something where the purpose of the consultation is to convince the people being consulted with of a particular answer to whatever the question is, rather than listening. A maximal version of participation requires that the voice, the young person's voice, is heard, but not only that the voice is heard, it also requires that the young people's voice has the capacity to influence decisions and outcomes. And ideally, the participation includes collaboration to generate solutions. Now, that maximal idea of participation is not very well enshrined in many spheres of life. That is not what people mean when they say participation. As adults, many of us will find ourselves in situations where participation is consultation without influence. And if we want to have a strong rights-based form of youth work, it has to be maximal participation, which means addressing some of the norms in society which are used to minimising the voices, not just of young people, but many other groups beside that. So youth work's very well placed to facilitate more maximal versions of participation than are normal in the broader society. And some of the things that youth work is doing and does do as a regular part of practice is involving young people in the co-creation of the programs that are offered. The co-creation is more than co-design. I'll talk about co-design as being more minimal because co-design only involves the young people in the initial stages. Co-creation is an ongoing collaboration. And this is something that youth workers are familiar with and very often have a strong commitment to doing. It also means involving young people in decision-making and in governance, so that young people get a voice that can actually change the way that services are offered, the way that provision occurs, the way that organisations run. It goes beyond a tokenistic form of participation. And another part of youth work that is quite established in many different programmes and has been since the quite early days of youth work is the idea that part of the central function of youth work is to support young people to develop leadership skills and to be involved in peer education and peer learning so that young people lead other young people and support other young people. Now, all these things are central, at least to some forms of youth work. And it's one of the reasons why youth work has to be a strategy for making human rights a reality in the way that Miriam was talking about. Because most of the other institutions that are working with young people don't necessarily put these values to the fore. We hear a lot certainly in Australia, I don't know whether it's the same in Scotland, about co-design. But co-design is not a maximal form of participation. It's not the most minimal, but it certainly only gives young people very limited input, generally at the beginning of a program or a service. And the same is true of representation, where the young people don't have any real likelihood of influencing any of the decision making that comes out of that representation. And if we only involve young people in that more minimal way, then young people aren't going to want to be involved in that sort of tokenistic way. The most minimal way is where young people are just present and joining in, and everything is designed and run by adults. Now, the benefits of the rights perspective, which I'm going over ground that has already been covered by our speakers much more comprehensively, are that most countries are signatories to the Convention on Human Rights, and that gives an international standing that provides a basis for youth work where there isn't any equivalent international agreement for any other basis. So it provides an international basis which there is agreement about. And I didn't know when I wrote this that the issue of incorporating the Convention on the Rights of the Child into domestic law was such a hot topic at present. But it does provide for that. This hasn't occurred in Australia, and this is something that in many ways is a limitation. There are bits of it that have been incorporated, but generally not the bits that empower young people. Generally, they're the bits that reduce the agency of young people. The Convention also provides formal support for young people to have a voice, to be consulted and to be heard, but it does need to go beyond that. It does need that young people's voice actually has some influence over outcomes. And there are many benefits of aligning youth work with other rights bodies, such as the Commissioners for Children and Young People and the various other human rights commissioners that exist in different countries, because that way it means that the voices have more weight. They are more united and more likely to have some influence on the political processes. There are, however, some cautions, and this is one that troubles me quite a lot, because one thing that does seem more prominent over the last 10 years is that the use of the word child to refer to young people 15, 16, 17, where previously you would have heard youth or young person, more and more I'm hearing the word child being used. And I'm hearing it in a way that actually takes the agency away from the young person. So not differentiating the young person who is potentially a mature minor from the child who is much younger. And that is something that I think, as a youth worker, concerns me quite a lot, and is a consequence of the sort of adultism. And it engenders the idea that the consultation with the young person can be legitimately ignored because adults know best. Similarly, a lot of the argument recently has suggested that young people's perspectives can be ignored because young people are too immature, with all sorts of spurious extrapolations from various bits of brain research. I haven't got time to go into that today, but the same standards about functional brains are not applied to adults who lose certain brain functionality as they age. They're only selectively applied to the supposed deficiency of young people. And I am concerned that this has been used to justify reducing young people's agency. So the conclusions are, from my perspective, and where we got to with this paper, was that we very much support the idea of rights as a useful foundation for youth work, with the proviso that young people must have a capacity to influence decisions, not just passive consultation, and also a right to agency, including participation in society. And I am quite concerned that some of that seems, the language of child seems to be being used to restrict that. Youth work certainly is very well placed to facilitate young people's active participation, collaboration, leadership, and co-creation. But we must guard against the sort of tokenism and unthinking or unconscious adultism that seems to be quite prominent in many parts of the everyday thinking of a lot of people beyond youth work who are infantilizing young people in a way that did not occur, perhaps certainly has changed over the time that I've been working as a youth worker. I've added some references at the end. I'll put a link to the paper in the chat, and these are my contact details. Thank you very much for inviting Tim, and Tim for inviting me. And Tim and I will be very happy to hear from anyone if you want to contact either of us following this presentation.